The first time Edna Lockhart cried after her husband died, she did it alone in the barn with her face pressed into the neck of her old gray mare, and she swore to herself it would be the last time she ever let grief take her that completely. That was 3 months before Perry Archer rode into Caldwell, Kansas, on a Tuesday in late September of 1878, trailing a string of horses behind him and wearing a battered hat that had seen more weather than most men twice his age. He was 29 years old, lean through the hips the way range riders tended to be, with dark brown eyes that had a habit of seeing more than most people wanted him to see. He came looking for work, the same as a dozen other cowboys who passed through Caldwell every season, though there was something in the unhurried way he moved that set him apart from the restless kind who blew through like tumbleweed and were gone before you learned their names. Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail in Sumner County, and in the fall of 1878, it was still rough enough around the edges to swallow men whole if they weren't careful. Cattle drives still came through, though the great rush of the early 70s had softened some. There were saloons and a hotel and a general store and a land office and a schoolhouse and a church that doubled as a courthouse on the days when Judge Hannigan rode in from Wichita. And there was the Lockhart place, 3 miles east of town on 40 acres of hard-won Kansas prairie, where Edna Lockhart had been trying to hold everything together since her husband Caleb had been thrown from a horse in June and broken his neck in a dry creek bed before anyone could get to him. Edna was 26 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she kept twisted up at the back of her head with a practicality that bordered on fierceness, and gray, eyes the color of storm clouds gathering over flat land. She was not the prettiest woman in Caldwell by the measurements that small towns tended to use, but she was the kind of woman who, when she walked into a room, made people straighten up without quite knowing why. She had been managing the farm mostly alone since Caleb died because her nearest neighbors, the Prater family, were dealing with their own drought and their own debts, and because Edna Lockhart did not ask for help. She had never been particularly good at it. Her mother had raised her to stand on her own 2 feet, and she had taken that lesson so deeply to heart that it had grown into something close to pride, and that pride had grown into something close to armor. She needed a hand for the fall work. She needed someone to help repair the south fence line that had been coming down for 2 months, and to break the 2 young horses Caleb had bought in the spring with the intention of doing it himself, and to get the hay in before the first hard frost turned it to nothing. She had managed the chickens and the garden and the cooking and the keeping of the house, and she had driven herself into town for supplies, and she had held every creditor off with a sharp tongue and a clear accounting of what was owed and when it would be paid. But the fence and the horses and the hay were beyond what she could do alone, and she knew it, and the knowing of it sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't shift. She heard about Perry Archer from me Dunmore, who ran the laundry in town and knew everything that happened within a 20-mile radius of Caldwell before anyone else did. Me told her over the counter of the general store that there was a cowboy newly arrived who had come down from the Colorado range with good references from a cattle outfit up there, and that he was looking for steady work for the season rather than the trail, and that he had been recommended by Tom Briggs at the livery as a man who knew horses the way some men know scripture. Edna listened with her eyes fixed on the bolt of muslin she was examining and said nothing until me finished. "I am not running a charity," Edna said. "Whatever he earns it." "Nobody said anything about charity," me said mildly. "I just thought you might want to know." Edna bought her muslin and her flour and her salt pork, loaded everything into her wagon, and drove 3 miles back to the farm without stopping to speak to anyone. But she thought about it the whole way home. She thought about the south fence and the unbroken horses and the hay going yellow in the field, and by the time she had unhitched the wagon and put the mare in the stall, she had made up her mind. She drove back into town the next morning. She found Perry Archer at the livery, as Tom Briggs had apparently mentioned she might, and she stood in the wide doorway with the September light hard and bright behind her, and looked at him the way she looked at everything she was considering purchasing, which was to say with a frankness that some people found uncomfortable. He was working with one of his own horses, running a hand down its foreleg with a patience that was not performative. He looked up when she came in, and he did not look startled or particularly impressed, which she found she respected. "You are Perry Archer," she said. It was not a question. "I am," he said. He straightened up, but he did not come toward her, which she also respected. "I am Edna Lockhart. I have a farm 3 miles east. I need someone who can break horses and do fence work and get a hay crop in before October turns cold. I can offer board in the bunkhouse and $3 a week. The work is honest and the hours are long, and I run a dry property." She paused. "If any of that is a problem, tell me now." Perry Archer looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes, and she had the unsettling impression that he was reading something in her face that she had not intended to put there. "None of that is a problem," he said. "Good," she said. "Can you start tomorrow?" "I can start today if you need me to." She considered him for another moment, then gave a short nod. "Today then," she said. "Follow me out when you are ready." She turned and walked back to her wagon without waiting to see if he would follow, because she had made her terms clear, and either he would honor them or he wouldn't, and if he wouldn't, she would find out soon enough. He followed. He packed his gear with a neatness that she noticed from the corner of her eye, and tied his horses to the back of her wagon, and climbed up beside her on the seat without being asked, because there was only one seat, and it would have been foolish to ride all the way out there on horseback when there was room. She did not particularly enjoy having a stranger sitting beside her, but she said nothing about it and kept her eyes on the road and the mare's dappled back. And Perry Archer said nothing either, which she found she appreciated more than she would have appreciated conversation. The farm came into view the way it always did, all at once as they crested a low rise, and Edna watched Perry Archer see it. She watched him take in the white house with its paint beginning to peel on the south-facing boards, and the barn that needed new shingles on the east slope, and the chicken yard and the garden, mostly done now in the autumn, and the pasture with the 2 young horses moving restlessly along the far fence. She watched him take it all in and say nothing, and she told herself that was exactly what she wanted. She did not want sympathy or observation. She did not want anyone looking at her farm and feeling sorry for her. He did not look sorry for her. He looked thoughtful, and then he pointed at the south fence line where it dipped toward the creek and said, "Is that the fence needing repair?" "Most of it," she said. "I'll look at it this afternoon," he said. "Tomorrow," she said. "This afternoon I need you to look at the horses." He turned to look at her, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. "All right," he said. "The horses today, the fence tomorrow." She showed him the bunkhouse, which was small and plain but clean because she kept everything clean as a matter of principle, and she told him where the well was and where she kept the tools and where the grain was stored. She did not offer him coffee or a meal because it was not yet noon and he had not done any work yet, and she was not running a hotel. He did not seem to expect any of it. He spent the whole of that first afternoon in the pasture with the 2 young horses, and she watched him from the kitchen window while she was making bread, watched him the way she watched weather, which was to say with attention and without sentiment. He was patient with them. He moved around them slowly and talked to them, she supposed, though she was too far away to hear what he said, and by the end of the afternoon he had a halter on the younger one and was leading it in circles with a matter-of-fact steadiness that the horse seemed to find reasonable. Caleb had been good with horses, too. The thought came before she could stop it, and she pressed it flat and went back to her bread. She gave Perry Archer his supper at the kitchen table, because it was simpler than making 2 meals, and because the bunkhouse had no stove, and she was not going to let a man work her land on an empty stomach. She put down a plate of beans and cornbread and salt pork and a cup of coffee without ceremony, and she sat across from him with her own plate, and neither of them said much at first. "The younger one will break clean," he said when he was about halfway through. The other one's got some spirit in him. He'll take more time, but he'll be worth it when you're done." Caleb thought so, she said, and then wished she hadn't said it because she didn't want to explain. "Your husband," Perry said without anything in his voice that she could take exception to. "He passed in June," she said. "I'm sorry," he said, just that. Not the long cascade of condolence and pity that she had been enduring from nearly everyone in Caldwell for 3 months. Just those 2 words, and then he went back to his beans. She had expected more, and the absence of more surprised her, and she thought about it after she had cleared the table and he had gone out to the bunkhouse, and she was alone in the house with the lamp burning low. She thought about the 2 words and how they had landed without weight, like something that acknowledged what was true without demanding anything from her in return. She did not sleep well. She had not slept well in 3 months. But she lay in the dark and thought about the south fence and the horses and the hay, and she thought about the way Perry Archer moved around those young horses, and she thought that she had probably made a reasonable decision. In the morning she woke before dawn as she always did, and she came into the kitchen to find that he had already been out to the barn and fed the mare and brought in wood for the stove. He had not knocked or announced himself. He had simply seen that it needed doing and done it. The wood was stacked neatly by the back door, and the stove was already lit, and the kitchen was beginning to warm when she came downstairs. She stood and looked at the stove and the wood for a moment, and something moved in her chest that she refused to name. She made breakfast for 2, eggs and biscuits and more coffee, and when he came in from checking the fence line in the early gray light, she put it on the table as before without ceremony or comment, and they ate in the same quiet way they had the night before. "The south fence is going to need new posts for about 40 yards, he said. "The old ones are rotted through at the base. You have posts." "In the barn. Caleb cut them last winter," she said. "Good," he said. "I'll start on it today." The days settled into a rhythm that surprised her by how naturally it came. Perry worked from first light until the light failed, and he worked with a consistency that she found she could rely on the way she relied on the sunrise. He did not need to be told what came next or reminded to finish what he had started. He fixed the fence and he worked with the horses every day, and in between those things he noticed what else needed doing and did it. He rehung the barn door that had been sagging on its hinges since July. He patched 3 places in the barn roof. He did not announce any of it or ask for praise. He just did it, and she found it. She told herself she was grateful for the practical reasons only. After 2 weeks, the younger horse was broke to saddle, and the older one was coming along better than she had hoped. Perry rode them both in the corral in the evenings, easy and light-handed, and Edna sometimes came out to lean on the fence rail and watch, because she was a farmer and these were her horses, and it was reasonable to watch their progress. She told herself that was the only reason she watched. One evening toward the end of October, she came out and found him sitting on the top rail of the corral fence with a piece of grass between his fingers, watching the 2 horses move together in the evening light, and she leaned on the rail beside him and they both watched the horses in silence for a while. "You are from Colorado," she said. "Originally from Missouri," he said. "Came out to Colorado when I was about 17, worked the range up there for a good while." "What brought you south?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Just moving," he said finally. There was something in the word that told her the answer was more complicated than that, but she did not push because she understood the principle of not being pushed. "Do you have family?" she asked. "A sister in Independence," he said. "We write sometimes." He paused. "You?" "My parents died when I was 18, she said. "A fever year. My husband's family is down in Texas, but we were not close." She paused. "I have always managed on my own." "I can see that," he said, and there was no admiration in it particularly and no criticism either, only the even recognition of a fact, and she found that easier than either admiration or criticism would have been. She went back inside because the supper needed attention, but she stood at the kitchen window stirring a pot and watched the lamplight falling yellow across the corral where he still sat on the fence rail in the last of the evening light, and she had the strange feeling that the farm felt different than it had for 3 months, and she did not altogether know what to do with that. October brought the first real cold, and with it, the urgency of the hay. Perry worked from before sunup cutting and raking, and they worked together those days, side by side in the field, because it needed 2 people, and she was not above working alongside a hired man. She drove the rake while he cut, and then they loaded the wagon together and stacked it in the barn, and there was a companionable silence to it that she found easier than she had expected. She had thought it would feel strange, working so closely with a man who was not Caleb. It did not feel strange. It felt practical, and underneath the practical there was something warm that she tried hard not to examine. On the 3rd day of haying, the wind turned and came hard out of the north and brought clouds with it, the kind of low gray clouds that meant rain before dark, and they both looked up at the same moment from different ends of the field. "We can finish the north section before it comes," Perry called across the cut grass. "We have to," she called back. They worked faster and the wind worked against them, and the first drops came when they still had the last load to get on the wagon. The rain came in earnest while they were driving back to the barn, a cold, hard October rain that soaked through a coat in minutes. They got the wagon inside and unhitched the horse in a hurry, and Perry threw a tarp over the last of the hay, while Edna got the horse into its stall. And then they both stood in the barn doorway looking at the rain falling in sheets across the farmyard and breathing hard from the work. Edna's hair had come half down from its knot and was lying wet against her neck and cheek. Her coat was soaked through. She had one of Caleb's old coats that she had been wearing for barn work, and it had not kept the rain out, and she was cold in a way that went through to the bones. She reached up without thinking about it and pushed the wet hair back from her face, and when she looked over at Perry, he was looking at the rain with that quiet expression that he always wore, not looking at her at all, and she did not know why she had half expected him to be looking at her. "We got it in," she said. "We did," he said. "Thank you," she said, which cost her something, because gratitude was another thing she was not particularly practiced at. He looked at her then briefly, and there was something in his eyes that she couldn't quite read. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "It's what I'm here for." Which was, of course, precisely true, and she had no idea why the words landed the way they did, with a small bright ache she was not prepared for. She made soup that evening, a thick bean and pork soup that she had been making since she was a girl, and she put it on the table with bread she had baked that morning, and they ate while the rain hammered the roof, and the wind moved around the corners of the house. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and the lamp made a yellow circle on the table between them, and she thought, against her will, that it was a very fine evening in a way that she had not thought any evening was fine in a long time. "You are a good cook," Perry said. "I know," she said, which made him actually smile for once, not just the almost smile she was used to, but a real one, and she found she had to look away from it because it did something unreasonable to the warmth in her chest. She was not going to be ridiculous about this. She was not going to be one of those women who confused gratitude and proximity for something more complicated. He was a hired hand, and she was a widow of 3 months, and she had a farm to manage, and she was going to keep all of that clearly in mind. She kept it clearly in mind for approximately 4 more days. It happened on a Friday. She had been into town that morning for supplies, and she had made the mistake of stopping at the land office to pay a partial payment on the note that Caleb had taken against the farm when they were first starting out. The land agent, a man named Grover Tillys who had the manners of a man who had never needed to develop any, had looked at her payment and told her that partial payments would no longer be accepted, and that the full note of $140 would need to be settled within 60 days or the farm would go to proceedings. Edna had looked at him for a long moment and said, "The original terms of the note allow for monthly payments." "The terms have been renegotiated by the bank in Wichita," Grover Tillys said, without looking up from his papers. "You should have received notice." "I did not receive notice," she said. "That is not my department," he said. She stood in the land office for another moment, and then she picked up her payment and put it back in her purse and walked out without another word because there was nothing she could say in that office that would serve her. She drove home. She unloaded the supplies. She put the mare in the stall. She went into the barn on the pretense of checking on the horses, and she stood in the dim, warm smell of hay and horses, and she pressed her face into the gray mare's neck the way she had done in June, and she cried. She cried with the controlled ferocity of someone who has allowed themselves exactly this much and no more, and the mare stood still and patient under her hands, and when it was over, Edna straightened up and wiped her face with the back of her hand and took a long, slow breath. Perry Archer was in the barn. He had come in through the far door to check on the water trough, and he was standing over by the young horse's stall with his back to her, doing something very intent and unnecessary with the latch on the stall door, working at it with complete absorption as though it were the most important latch in Sumner County, and required his full attention for the foreseeable future. He had not turned around. He had not announced himself. He had heard her or seen her, she was certain of it, and he had turned his back and occupied himself with the latch and was giving her every appearance of having seen nothing and heard nothing, and he was staying. He was not leaving the barn, which would have meant passing by her, and he was not pressing in closer either. He was just there with his back turned and the latch in his hands, present and not watching, close and not intrusive. She stood for a moment looking at the back of him, the square of his shoulders under his work shirt, the way his hands moved on the latch with that steady, unhurried patience he brought to everything. "The latch is fine," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady her voice was. "I thought it felt a little loose," he said, without turning around immediately. "It is perfectly fine," she said. He turned around then slowly and looked at her with those dark level eyes, and there was nothing in his expression that said he had seen her cry. There was nothing in it that said anything except a quiet steadiness that somehow made her want to press her face back into the horse's neck and start all over again, which was absolutely not going to happen. "I'll go start on that water trough," he said. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He walked past her without looking at her too closely, and she stood in the barn for another minute alone, and she told herself that was the end of it, and she was going to go inside and make supper and think about what she was going to do about Grover Tilley's and the land note, and that was what mattered. But that night at supper she told him about the land office. She was not sure afterward why she told him. She had not planned to. She had planned to work out the problem herself in the manor. She worked out all her problems, which was alone and by force of will. But they were sitting at the table and he asked in his even way if everything was all right, and she realized her jaw had been set in the way it's set when she was fighting something, and she thought that he would probably notice it anyway, and she told him. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated, and when she was done he was quiet for a moment. 60 days, he said. Yes. What is the note amount? $140. He was quiet again, looking at the table. You have the horses now, he said. The broke ones, what are they worth? She looked at him. The younger one maybe 35. The older one I could get 50 for probably if I found the right buyer. That is 85, he said. What else can you put together? I have about 20 saved from the summer's milk sales, she said, slowly working it out as she spoke. And there's the fall hay yield I could sell some of. Another 20, perhaps 25. That puts you at 120 to 130, he said. Still short, she said. He nodded slowly. I have a little put by, he said. She looked at him sharply. No, she said. Absolutely not. He met her eyes. I have $14, he said. It is not a loan. Consider it part of my wages held back. You have not held back any wages, she said. I pay you what we agreed and I pay it on time. Then consider it an investment, he said. If you lose the farm, you lose the horses, and I lose the job, and we both come out worse. She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze without flinching. No, she said finally. I will find another way, but I appreciate the offer. He did not argue, which she also appreciated. He just nodded and went back to his supper. But after he had gone out to the bunkhouse that night, she sat at the kitchen table with her lamp and her ledger, and worked through the numbers 6 times and got 6 different answers, none of which reached $140 in 60 days. And for the first time since June, she felt the particular fear that comes from a problem that does not have a clear solution. She slept badly. She rose early and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table while it was still dark and thought about her options. She could sell both horses. She could sell the fall hay yield. She could take in washing. She could ask Grover Tillys for an extension, though she would rather walk barefoot to Wichita than ask Grover Tillys for anything. She could appeal to the bank directly, bypassing Tillys. That last one, she held on to that one. In the morning she told Perry she needed to make a trip to Wichita, which was 3 hours by wagon, and asked if he could manage the farm for 2 days. "Of course," he said. "Do you want company on the road?" "No," she said. "I am perfectly capable of driving to Wichita." "I know you are," he said. "I only meant the road is rough and the weather is turning, but if you would rather go alone, go alone." She thought about the cold and the rough road and the fact that it would be dark before she got back if she went alone. She thought about her pride, and she thought about $140, and she thought about the farm. "You could come," she said, "if you have nothing pressing here." They left before dawn, both of them wrapped in heavy coats, Perry driving while she sat beside him with the map of the conversation she intended to have laid out in her mind. The sky was gray and close, and the prairie stretched away in every direction, brown and dry and enormous in the way that Kansas plains are enormous in a way that can either comfort or terrify, depending on your state of mind. "Tell me about Wichita," Perry said after a while. "What do you want to know?" she said. "What is the bank? Who runs it?" "Citizens Bank of Sumner County," she said. "The manager is a man called Howard Beale. He is reasonable, I think, if you come to him with good faith and clear numbers." "Then go to him with good faith and clear numbers," Perry said. "That is exactly what I plan to do," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You have a good case," he said. "The note has been paid faithfully by you and your husband for 3 years. The harvest is in. You have horses to sell. You have a clear record. Any reasonable man will see that." She looked at him sideways. "How do you know about the 3 years?" "You told me about the note," he said, without any particular significance. She turned back to the road. "I did," she said. She had not remembered telling him that detail, but she must have. "Yes, 3 years. We never missed a payment." They rode in silence for a while, and the land rolled by, enormous and still, and the sky stayed gray and low. Around mid-morning, a few light snowflakes came down, the first of the season, and landed on the horses' backs and on the wagon seat between them and melted. "Snow," Edna said. "First of the year," Perry said. "I know," she said. And then, because she was thinking about it, "Caleb always said the first snow smelled like iron. I never knew what he meant until the first winter after we were married, and I came out one morning, and the air was different, and I knew before I looked up that it was going to snow." She had not talked about Caleb to anyone, really, since he died. She had talked around him, about him in terms of accounts and decisions and what he had built and what he had left behind, but not like this. Perry said, "Did you grow to like Kansas winters?" "No," she said, "but I respect them." He made a small sound that was the almost laugh she had come to recognize. "That is a very Edna Lockhart thing to say," he said. She looked at him. "You are very free with my name," she said. "You are very free with mine," he said, easily. She turned back to the road, and she was aware that the corner of her own mouth was doing something she had not authorized. They reached Wichita before noon. Edna went into the Citizens Bank of Sumner County with her ledger under her arm and her back straight, and she asked to see Howard Beale. Perry waited outside with the wagon, and she was glad of that because she did not want him to see her negotiate, which was a form of vulnerability she was not prepared to share. Howard Beale was a compact man in his 50s with round glasses and a manner that was formal but not unkind. Edna laid out her ledger, her payment record, her expected income from the horse sales and the hay yield, and she told him clearly and without ornamentation that Grover Tillys had not given her proper notice of the changed terms, and that she was requesting the original monthly payment schedule be reinstated. Howard Beale looked at her ledger for a long time. Then he looked at her. "Mrs. Lockhart," he said, "the change in terms was irregular, and I will admit that the notice was inadequate. I will extend the original payment schedule for a further 6 months on the condition that you bring the account current by January." Current by January meant she needed to pay what had been accumulating in missed partial payments, which was about $40. She could do $40 by January. She knew she could. "That is acceptable," she said. She walked out of the bank into the cold Wichita street, and for a moment she just stood there in the gray light and breathed. And the relief was so large that she had to be careful with it, had to hold it at arm's length until she was sure she had a grip on herself. Perry was leaning against the wagon with his hat tipped forward against the cold, and he looked up when she came out. He read something in her face, and his own face did the thing it did sometimes, went a little warmer, though he kept it quiet. "Good news," he said. "Manageable news," she said. "That is the best kind," he said, and she thought that was exactly right. They ate at a small restaurant on the main street of Wichita, a plain meal of roast beef and potatoes, and it was the first time Edna had eaten in a restaurant since before Caleb died, and she found she had forgotten the particular feeling of sitting at a table in a public place and having food brought to you. Perry ate with the same uncomplicated appetite he brought to her kitchen table, and they talked more easily than they usually did. Perhaps because they were away from the farm and its weight, or perhaps because the morning's success had loosened something. He told her about the cattle drives he had been on up through Colorado and New Mexico, and about a stampede in a thunderstorm near Pueblo that he told with a dry humor that made her laugh, actually laugh, for the first time in long enough that it surprised her when it came out. It surprised him too, she thought, from the way his eyes changed. But he did not make much of it, just continued his story, and she was grateful for that because she was not ready to be seen laughing yet, not properly. On the way back it was already dark before they were halfway home, just as he had predicted, and the stars came out bright and hard over the flat land, and the horses moved steadily in their traces. Edna had been awake since before 4 in the morning, and the long day and the warmth of relief were catching up with her, and at some point her head found its way to Perry Archer's shoulder without her permission. She woke when the wagon stopped. She woke with a jolt of awareness and sat upright and said, "We are home," in a voice she hoped sounded like she had been fully awake for the entire journey. "We are home," he said, with complete composure, climbing down to see to the horses. She went inside and lit the lamp and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands pressed flat on the table, her heart doing something she was going to firmly decline to analyze. November came. The farm settled into winter's approach, and there was less urgent work, which meant more time for the small, persistent repairs and preparations that a farm requires before hard cold sets in. Perry winterized the barn, stuffing the cracks against the wind and banking the foundation with straw bales, and he made sure the woodpile was substantial enough to last through March. Edna sold the younger horse to a rancher south of town for $38, more than she had expected, and put the money against the bank account. Their evenings fell into a pattern. Supper at the kitchen table, and then sometimes she would sew and he would sit and read from one of the books she had, because she had a small shelf of books and he was, she discovered, a reader, which surprised her and then did not surprise her at all. He read the way he did everything, with a quiet absorption, and sometimes one of them would read something aloud to the other, and those evenings became the ones she looked forward to most, which was information she kept entirely to herself. Me Dunmore came out to visit in the second week of November, which she did occasionally, and she sat in Edna's kitchen with her tea and her sharp eyes, and Edna could see her taking inventory of the 2 coffee cups on the shelf and the extra boots by the back door and the general evidence of a man in the vicinity. "I hear you took on Perry Archer for the season," Me said. "I needed help with the horses and the fence and the hay," Edna said. "He is a good-looking man," Me said, with elaborate neutrality. Is he? Edna said, in a tone that discouraged further comment. Me looked at her over her teacup and said nothing more on the subject, but her expression said a great deal. After Me had gone, Edna stood at the kitchen window and thought about what it meant that she had noticed, without Me's prompting, that Perry Archer was a good-looking man. She had noticed it, she admitted to herself, in the way one might notice a fact that is true but not particularly actionable. He was dark-eyed and broad-shouldered, and he had a way of being still that was different from the stillness of dull men. It was the stillness of a man who was simply content in the present moment, and she found it restful in a way that she had not expected to find anything restful for a very long time. That was as far as she was willing to take it. On a Wednesday in mid-November, she came down with a cold. It was not a serious cold, but it was persistent and inconvenient, and it made her head heavy and her chest tight. And she woke on the second morning of it feeling worse than the first morning and lay in bed for a full 15 minutes, which was 15 minutes longer than she had lain in bed since she was 12 years old and had had scarlet fever. She got up because there was no useful alternative to getting up, and she came downstairs in her heavy wrapper and found that the stove was lit and the coffee was made, and there was a pot of something on the back of the stove keeping warm. She lifted the lid. It was oatmeal, stirred and sweetened with a little molasses, and there was no one in the kitchen. She stood and looked at the oatmeal. She was absolutely not going to make anything of a pot of oatmeal. She ate the oatmeal and drank the coffee and felt marginally better, and she got dressed and went out to do the morning chores and found that the animals had already been fed and watered and the barn was in order. Perry was up at the fence line doing some reinforcement work she had asked about and had not expected him to get to until next week. She went back inside and took a dose of the patent medicine she had in the cupboard for winter ailments, and she spent most of the day indoors because going out into the cold with a chest cold was foolish, and she was not a foolish woman. She made a soup for dinner because soup was what she could manage, and she had it on the table when he came in. He looked at her when he sat down, a quick assessing look that she had come to recognize as his way of checking whether things were as they should be. "How are you feeling?" He said, "Fine," she said. "The soup is ready." He did not push. He ate his soup, and when he was done he said, "Is there willow bark in the medicine box?" "There is," she said. "I have already had the patent medicine." "Patent medicine has a lot of alcohol and very little else," he said. "My mother swore by willow bark for fever." "I do not have a fever," she said. "You have a slight fever," he said, with the calm matter-of-factness of someone stating a compass direction. She opened her mouth to contradict him and then touched her own forehead, which was, she admitted, warmer than it should have been. "I am fine," she said, which was different from saying she did not have a slight fever. He made the willow bark tea from the box in the cupboard and put it in front of her without comment, and she drank it because she was not going to be childish about willow bark tea when she had a slight fever. She went to bed early and slept better than she had in weeks, and in the morning the fever was gone and the cold had lightened, and she stood at the top of the stairs for a moment and thought about willow bark tea and a pot of oatmeal and a man with his back turned to the latch, and she thought, "This is a problem." Not a problem in the way the land note was a problem, a different kind of problem. The kind that she was quite sure she was not equipped to handle, because she had not expected to need to handle anything of the sort for a very long time, if ever again. She went downstairs and made breakfast for two and did not say anything about it. December came early and hard that year, the way it sometimes did on the Kansas plains, a cold that had teeth and the wind to drive them. They got a snowstorm in the first week that kept them both inside for 2 days, which was more time in close quarters than they had spent together before. Edna cleaned things that did not need cleaning and rearranged the kitchen shelves and baked 3 loaves of bread, and Perry read and mended tack and helped her carry in wood, and generally moved through the cramped space of the house with a considerateness that she found almost more difficult than if he had been in the way. On the second day of the storm, in the evening, she asked him why he had left Colorado. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I was engaged to be married up in Colorado." She kept her eyes on the seam she was working on. "What happened?" she said. "She married someone else," he said. "It was 2 years ago." I held it against myself for longer than was reasonable, and eventually I left because the place felt like the holding. Edna was quiet for a moment. "That is understandable," she said. She looked up. "Are you still holding it?" He met her eyes. "No," he said. "I set it down somewhere on the road between Colorado and Kansas." She looked back at her sewing. "Good," she said. They were quiet for a while. The wind came hard at the walls and the lamp flickered. "What was she like?" Edna asked, and was immediately not sure why she had asked. "Different from you," he said, which was not an answer and was completely an answer, and Edna's needle stilled for a moment before she resumed her seam. She did not look up. She did not ask what he meant. She told herself she had no need to know what he meant, but she thought about it after she had gone to bed, in the way she thought about things at night when there was no practical task to occupy her mind. Different from you. She was not sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing from his point of view, and she spent more time wondering about it than she was strictly comfortable admitting. Christmas came. Edna did not make much of Christmas as a rule. She cooked a better meal than usual, and that was the extent of it. This year she made a roast chicken and a dried apple pie and a pudding she had been saving the ingredients for since October, and she set the table with the cloth she kept for occasions. And when Perry sat down and saw the cloth and the better china, something in his face went quiet and careful in a way she had not seen before. "Thank you," he said. "This is very fine." "It is just Christmas," she said, sitting down across from him. "Just Christmas," he agreed, and picked up his fork. And she thought from the way he said it that Christmas had not always been kind to him either. After the meal, she gave him a pair of good wool gloves she had knitted over the past 3 weeks in the evenings, working on them when he was otherwise occupied or when he had gone out to the bunkhouse. She set them on the table beside his plate without ceremony. He looked at them for a moment. He picked them up and turned them in his hands, and she could see him working out that she had made them. "Edna," he said, and stopped. "You needed new gloves," she said. "Your old ones have a hole in the right thumb." "I know," he said. He looked at her. "Thank you." She gathered the plates. "They are practical," she said. "That is all." He went out to the bunkhouse that evening and came back 10 minutes later and knocked at the kitchen door, which he had never done before, always coming in from the back the way he had a habit of doing. She opened it and he held out a small carved wooden figure, a horse, small and detailed and clearly made with patience and skill, the wood rubbed smooth. "I found the piece of wood in the barn," he said. "I have been working on it when I had the time. It is not much." She took it from him. It was a small running horse, caught in motion, and it was lovely, the kind of thing a man made with his hands when he was thinking about something. "It is very much," she said, and her voice did not behave itself the way she wanted it to, and she looked down at the small carved horse to avoid looking at him. He went back to the bunkhouse, and she stood in the kitchen holding the horse and told herself very firmly that she was not going to cry about a Christmas gift, especially not after she had already cried in the barn that one time, and especially not when she was in the kitchen alone, where there was no one to look away from the latch anyway. She put the horse on the kitchen windowsill where she could see it in the mornings, and she told herself that was a practical decision, because it was a pleasant thing to look at. January was cold and white, and the farm was quiet under its layer of snow. The older horse was fully broke now, and Edna had not yet sold him, partly because she wanted to be sure about the buyer and partly, she admitted to herself in her more honest moments, because she was not ready to have one less thing that Perry Archer had worked for on her behalf. She found excuses to keep the horse another month, and she found that the month contained things she was not expecting. On a clear, cold morning in the second week of January, Perry was out breaking a path to the barn after a night's snowfall, and Edna brought him coffee in a tin cup, just because the cold was sharp and she had made it anyway. He took the cup and their fingers touched in the exchange, just for a moment through the cold, and he looked at her and she looked at him and neither of them said anything at all. She went back inside. She stood in the kitchen with her back against the door and her empty hands at her sides, and she thought, this is considerably more than a problem. She thought about it for 3 days. She thought about it practically, the way she thought about every problem that required a decision. She thought about what she knew about him, which was, he was reliable and patient, and he worked as hard as any man she had ever seen, and he was kind in a way that did not announce itself. He was not a man who would leave without saying so. He was not a man who said things he did not mean. He had a sister in Missouri, and he had set down a grief 2 years ago and come a long way and stayed when he could have gone. She thought about all of that. She thought about herself, which was harder. She thought about the fact that she was 26 years old and she had been alone for 7 months, and she was not going to pretend, in the privacy of her own mind, that she was not lonely, because she was. She had been lonely for longer than 7 months, honestly. Caleb had been a good man and a decent husband, but he had been 10 years older, and they had been fond of each other in a way that was comfortable and companionable, and had never been quite this. Whatever this was. She also thought about the fact that she was Edna Lockhart, who did not ask for things, and that whatever happened next would have to come from her because she was quite certain that Perry Archer would wait until the sun burned out before he would presume. She sat with this for 3 days, and on the 4th day she walked out to the barn where he was brushing the older horse, and she stood in the doorway and said, "Perry." He looked up. "If you were to think about staying past the season," she said, "I would not be against it." He was quiet, looking at her with those dark eyes. "Staying as what?" he said carefully. She met his eyes. "As whatever you would like to stay as," she said. He set the brush down slowly. He walked toward her with that unhurried way he had, and he stopped when he was close enough that she had to tip her chin up to look at him properly, and he said, "I would like to stay as the man who is in love with you, if that is an option." She looked at him. Her heart was doing something entirely outside her usual control, and she was aware that her eyes were going bright in a way she was going to find problematic if she was not careful. "That is an option," she said, and her voice was steady, and she was deeply proud of how steady her voice was. He lifted one hand and touched her face, his thumb brushing along her cheekbone, and she leaned into it without meaning to, and he smiled, the real one she had seen that first time in the kitchen and had been cataloging the rare appearances of ever since. He kissed her gently, with the same patience he brought to horses and fence posts and willow bark tea, and she kissed him back with the same stubborn thoroughness she brought to everything, and the old gray mare regarded them both with complete indifference. "I have been wanting to do that since about October," Perry said, against her forehead. "Only since October," she said. He laughed, the real laugh she had also been cataloging, and pulled her close, and she let herself stay there for a moment in the cold barn with the smell of hay and horses and his warm coat under her cheek. And she thought that she had been right, that first September morning, when she had told herself she had probably made a reasonable decision. She had made an excellent decision. The winter moved on and the farm moved on with it. And things were different in the particular way that things are different when something enormous has quietly been decided. They were together in the evenings without it being a question anymore, reading by the lamp, or talking over the day's small business, or sitting in a comfortable silence that had a different quality now, warmer and more deliberate. He moved from the bunkhouse into the house itself in February, when the cold became severe enough that the bunkhouse stove was insufficient, and the pretense of keeping him out there for propriety's sake had begun to feel thin to both of them. They gave themselves to each other with the quiet seriousness of two people who had both learned what loss tasted like and were not interested in wasting anything. On the day in late February when Edna sold the older horse to a rancher from Medicine Lodge for $52, which was more than she had expected and enough to settle the January payment to the bank with a little over, she came home and told Perry, and he swung her up off the ground the way people do in stories, the way she had always privately thought was a bit much, and she found that it was not a bit much at all. March came with mud and the early sounds of spring, the blackbirds coming back, the smell of the soil changing the way the air changed before snow, into something alive and waiting. Edna planted her kitchen garden in the second week of March, pushing seeds into the cold ground with the conviction of someone who has done this before and knows that it works even when it seems unlikely. Perry helped her, kneeling in the mud without complaint, and without the commentary that many men might have offered about the suitability of garden work. They talked, those days, in the long, easy way of people who have stopped keeping things back. He told her about Missouri and the farm he had grown up on, poor land his father had broken himself and lost eventually to drought in the late 60s, and about riding out at 17 with nothing much, and finding that he was better suited to moving than to staying, or had been until he wasn't. She told him about her parents and the fever, and being 18 and alone and learning to be afraid of nothing because being afraid of things was a luxury she couldn't afford. "You are still afraid of things," he said, digging a row with a stick as she came behind him with the seeds. "I know that," she said. "I just do not let them see it." "I have noticed," he said. She looked at him sidelong. He kept his eyes on the row. She thought about the barn and the latch and the way he had turned his back, and she thought that he had always known that about her and had always honored it, and she found that this was not a small thing. "You never said anything," she said. "You did not need me to," he said. She pushed a seed into the ground. "Some people would say I should let people in more," she said. "Some people do not know you," he said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him, and he looked up at her, and she thought, "Here is a man who sees exactly what I am and finds it agreeable, not what he would like me to be, not what is expected, what I actually am." She leaned forward and kissed him in the middle of the kitchen garden, with mud on both of their hands and a Kansas spring wind moving across the flat land, and he kissed her back with his hand warm on the side of her face, and neither of them cared at all about the mud. He asked her to marry him on an evening in early April. He did it simply, the way he did everything, sitting across from her at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp between them, and he said he would like very much to be her husband if she would have him, and that he understood she was her own person and he had no intention of changing that, and that he would like to put his roots down here, on this farm, on this particular piece of hard Kansas prairie with her. She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and she looked down at their hands joined on the checked tablecloth and felt something settle in her, deep and sure, the way things settle when they have found where they belong. They were married in May in Caldwell, in the church that doubled as a courthouse on Judge Hannigan's days, on a warm, bright morning with the cottonwoods in leaf along the creek, and the whole town more or less present because small towns in Kansas in 1879 did not miss a wedding if they could help it. Me Dunmore cried, which Edna had expected. The Prater family came from next door and brought a pie, which Edna had also expected. Tom Briggs from the livery shook Perry's hand with a vigor that suggested he felt personally responsible for the outcome, which Edna found entirely Me Dunmore's territory of responsibility, but let pass. Edna wore a dress she had made herself from good green cotton she had ordered from the dressmaker in Wichita, and she wore her hair up in its usual way but with her mother's ivory combs, which she had kept in a box since she was 18 and had not worn in all the years since. Perry wore a clean dark coat and his best hat, and looked at her when she came down the aisle of the church with an expression she had never seen on his face before, open and unguarded in a way he almost never was, and she filed it carefully in the place where she kept things she wanted to hold on to. Judge Hannigan performed the ceremony with more sentiment than Edna had expected from a circuit judge. Perry said his vows in his quiet, steady voice, looking at her directly, and she said hers back to him the same way, and when it was done, he kissed her properly in front of the whole town of Caldwell, which made Me Dunmore cry harder and made Edna's face do something warm and involuntary that she decided, for once, not to suppress. The farm in the summer of 1879 was different from the farm in the summer of 1878, in ways that Edna sometimes thought about in the mornings when she was in the kitchen watching the early light come across the prairie. It was not different in its difficulty, because farming in Kansas was always difficult, the land requiring everything you had in every season. But there was someone beside her in the difficulty, and that changed the texture of everything. Not because it made her less capable or less herself, but because there is a particular quality to hard work that is shared, the way the weight is distributed differently, and the tiredness at the end of the day is a tiredness you can put down together instead of carrying alone into sleep. They bought 2 more horses in the late spring from a rancher south of Caldwell who was selling up and moving to New Mexico, and Perry worked with them through the summer the same way he had worked with the first 2, patiently and steadily. And Edna watched him from the fence rail in the evenings the way she had that first September and thought about how much had been accomplished in a year. She also thought, in the late summer, about the fact that she was likely pregnant. She was not certain until September, but she had suspected since August, and she had kept the suspicion to herself in the way she kept everything to herself until she was sure. She told Perry on a Sunday evening when supper was done and the dishes were cleared and they were sitting together on the porch steps in the cooling air, watching the prairie settle into darkness. He was quiet for a moment after she told him. "September," he said. "I think February or March," she said. He put his arm around her and pulled her against his side, and she let herself lean into him and they sat there in the growing dark, and she could feel his breathing change in the way it changed when he was moved by something but not going to say so immediately. After a while he said, "Are you frightened?" She thought about it honestly. "Some," she said. "Are you?" "Some," he said. "Good," she said. "That is reasonable." He pressed his lips to her temple and held them there for a moment, and she sat with her head against his shoulder and the night coming down over Kansas, and felt the rightness of things in a way she had never quite felt it before, or had not felt it in so long that it had the quality of something almost new. The pregnancy was not easy, not the way it sometimes is, but it was not dangerous either. She was sick in the mornings through November and December, which she found intensely annoying, and she kept working the farm regardless because the farm did not care about morning sickness. Perry picked up the outdoor work that was beyond her without discussion, and when she was sick, he was matter-of-fact about it, not fussing but present, and when she was irritable from the exhaustion, he took her irritability in stride the same way he took Kansas weather, as a fact of the landscape that required adjusting to rather than arguing with. She appreciated this more than she could easily articulate. The child was born in March of 1880, at the beginning of the month when the first hints of spring were beginning to show in the lengthening of the days, if not yet in the warmth. He came into the world on a Tuesday morning, which Edna always thought afterward was fitting since so many things had begun on a Tuesday. He was healthy and loud and had his father's dark hair, and when Perry came into the room and the midwife put the boy in his arms, Edna watched his face do the open, unguarded thing it had done at the wedding, all the quietness stripped away, something enormous and uncontained, and she thought that this was perhaps the best thing she had ever seen. "What do you want to name him?" Perry said. He was still looking at the baby. "I thought Thomas," she said, "after your father if you agree." He looked up at her then. He had the expression of a man who had been prepared for something but not quite this specific thing, and he looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him find the steadiness that was always available to him and use it to hold something large. "Thomas Archer," he said. "Thomas Archer," she agreed. He sat down on the edge of the bed with the baby and she leaned back against the pillows, exhausted in the clean, straightforward way of having done something enormous and finished it. And she watched her husband holding their son and thought about the pride that had kept her from letting anyone see her cry, and how that same pride lived in her still. She was still herself and always would be. But how it was different now, seated beside something she had not expected, a willingness to be seen. Not by everyone. Not openly and without reservation, but by him. She had let Perry Archer see her, not all at once but gradually, the way ice gives in spring, from the outside first and then from deeper in, and here they were on the other side of it. She thought about the barn and the latch, and she thought that she would tell him about that someday. That she knew he had heard her and had turned away, that she had known even then that he was the kind of man who would stay close without making a point of it. She would tell him someday. Or perhaps she would not need to, because he already knew, and she already knew that he knew, and some things between two people who know each other well enough do not need to be said. Thomas grew. The spring of 1880 was kinder than the spring of the year before, more rain and less wind, and the farm came into its best year since Edna had been running it alone. The hay grew thick in the north field, and Perry managed the horses with a skill that was beginning to generate its own reputation around Caldwell, men coming to ask if he had horses to sell or if he could recommend animals for them. And Edna saw in this the beginning of something that could become a proper horse operation alongside the farming. She brought it up to him one evening and laid out the numbers the way she laid out all numbers, clearly and without sentiment, and he listened and asked several good questions, and they talked about it for 2 hours in the kitchen while Thomas slept in his cradle by the stove. It would mean more investment up front, Perry said. Another good stallion to start. I know, she said. I think we can do it by next spring if this year's harvest is what it looks like. He looked at the numbers she had written down. It could be good, he said. It will be good, she said, and he looked at her and smiled. Yes, he said, it will be good. Me Dunmore came to see Thomas in the spring and sat in the kitchen making appreciative noises about the baby and sharp observations about everything else, and she told Edna that she was looking well, by which me meant something more than health. Edna knew what me meant because me always meant what she didn't say more than what she did. I am well, Edna said. You look happy, me said, which was what she had meant all along. Edna looked at me over her teacup. I am, she said. Me beamed. I knew it, she said, from the moment I told you about him. You introduced the idea of him, Edna said. I made all the subsequent decisions. Of course you did, me said comfortably, and helped herself to another biscuit. The summer of 1880 was long and productive. Perry bought a young stallion from a rancher outside of Wichita, and the horse breeding operation they had talked about began to take its first tentative shape. They fenced a new pasture on the east side of the property, the two of them working the posts in together the way they had worked the south fence that first October, with the comfort of two people who know how the other one works. Edna held the post while Perry drove it, and when it was done, she checked its alignment the same way she checked everything, with her eye and her level, and no room for approximation. Straight, she said. I know it is, he said cheerfully, because after more than a year and a half he had developed a cheerfulness about her precision that was one of the things she loved about him, that he found her exactness something to smile at rather than something to argue with. She loved him. She had known it for a long time, and she thought about it in those days of summer with the particular clarity that comes when you are standing in a life you have built, looking at what you have built, and finding it sound. She told him one evening, the way she told him things that mattered, directly and without excess. They were on the porch in the summer evening, Thomas asleep inside, and she said, I love you, Perry. Not as a response to anything he had said, not in a moment of particular feeling, just as a statement of fact, the way she would have said the south fence is holding or the harvest will be good. He looked at her for a moment, and his mouth did the thing it did, the real smile. I know, he said. I have known it for a while. Since when? She said. Since November, he said. You brought me coffee in the cold, and you looked at me like you were irritated about it. She laughed. I was not irritated. You were fighting something, he said. It looked like irritation from the outside. She shook her head and looked out at the prairie and the evening light going gold across it, and she said, I love you, once more, just because it was worth saying more than once. I love you, he said quietly beside her, and that was that. A thing named and known and set down between them like a foundation post, solid and true. In the autumn of 1880, Grover Tillys left the Caldwell Land Office, retired or dismissed. The town was not precisely sure which, and a new agent was installed who was, by all accounts, a reasonable man. Edna went into the land office in October to make her regular payment and came out having made the final one. The note retired completely, the farm free and clear. She stood on the Caldwell Street in the October sun and felt the particular freedom of something that has been a weight so long you have stopped fully registering its heaviness until it is gone. She drove home and told Perry, and he put down what he was doing and came and stood with her in the farmyard and looked at their land, really looked at it, the house and the barn and the new east pasture and the horses moving in it, and she looked at it with him. "It is ours," she said. "It has always been yours," he said. "Now it is ours." She took his hand. The years that followed were the years of building, not the anxious building of survival, but the steady building of people who have found their footing and know where they are going. The horse operation grew into a genuine business, Perry's skill and Edna's accounting working together the way their different strengths always worked, each one shoring up what the other left open. They had buyers coming from as far as Wichita and occasionally from further, men who had heard about Archer horses and come to see for themselves. Perry handled the horses and the buyers and the training, and Edna handled the books and the agreements and the breeding records with a thoroughness that left no room for misunderstanding. Thomas learned to walk in the spring of 1881 and took to following his father around the farm with a single-minded devotion that Edna found both charming and faintly alarming, because he was very small and the farm was very large, and he had his father's habit of absolute absorption in the task at hand, which in a toddler manifested as walking directly into fences without noticing them. He was a bright and happy child who had his father's patience and his mother's will, which Perry said was either going to make him extraordinary or make him impossible to reason with, and Edna said those were not mutually exclusive possibilities. In the winter of 1882, Edna was pregnant again. This time she was not sick in the mornings, which she considered an improvement, and she felt the whole thing differently, with more ease, less anxiety, more of the quiet certainty that she had developed about most things over the years. The baby came in July, a summer birth, which was unusual enough that the midwife commented on it. A girl this time, small and dark-haired like Thomas, and she arrived with an opinion about it that was audible in the next room. "She is loud," Perry said, with great warmth. "She has opinions," Edna said, looking at the baby. "Good." They named her Clara after Perry's mother, and Clara grew into the name with the same determination that Thomas was growing into everything, loudly and with complete commitment. Me Dunmore, who had become a genuine friend over the years in the way that proximity and honesty eventually make people into friends, came out regularly and made herself useful in the way that capable women do. And she watched Edna's children grow and watched Edna soften by increments without losing any of the core of herself that had always been there. The uprightness, the exactness, the refusal to be diminished by anything. Me thought and told her husband occasionally in the evenings that Perry Archer had not changed Edna Lockhart. He had simply found her. It was summer of 1883 when the neighboring property, the Prater land, came up for sale. The Prater family had sold their operation and moved to relatives in Missouri, and the land, 80 acres of good Kansas prairie land with a creek running the south edge, was available. Edna found out about it from the new land agent, who told her because he had been told by Howard Beale at the bank in Wichita that Edna Archer, as she was now, was a reliable and creditworthy borrower, a description she found both accurate and gratifying. She brought it to Perry that evening after the children were in bed. She put the numbers on the table, the asking price and the terms, and what they could reasonably borrow against the existing farm and the horse business, and she sat back and looked at him. He looked at the numbers for a long time, then he looked at her. 80 acres, he said. Good land, she said. We know it. We could run twice the horses, he said. More than twice, she said. He was quiet, the particular quiet that meant he was thinking seriously rather than the quiet that meant he was leaving her space, and she waited him out because she always waited him out when he was thinking. "What is the risk?" he said. She walked him through it, the way she walked through everything, clearly and without softening the difficult parts. The loan would be significant. If the horse business had a bad year, it would be tight. Kansas weather was always a variable. But the land itself, once paid for, was sound, and the creek on the south edge would support the additional stock. "I think we should do it," she said when she had finished laying it out. "Then let us do it," he said. She looked at him. "You do not need more time. I trust your numbers," he said, "and I trust your judgment. If you think we should do it, we should do it." She had been trusted with things in her life, had trusted herself with things, but there was something particular about hearing those words from him, about being trusted specifically by the person who knew her most fully, and she felt it move through her the way important things moved, quietly and deeply. They bought the Prater land in September of 1883. It increased the Archer operation from 40 to 120 acres when you included both parcels, and it changed the scale of what they were building in a way that Edna had not let herself fully imagine until it was real and the deed was in her hand. She stood in the new field the first morning after the purchase was completed, just stood there in the early light with the dew on the grass and the creek running quiet at the south edge, and the whole possibility of it laid out in front of her. And she thought about a Tuesday in September of 1878 when she had driven into town looking for help and had found, in the clean, dusty light of a livery, something considerably larger than what she had been looking for. Perry came up behind her and stood beside her in the field, and for a long moment they were both quiet in the way they were quiet together now, the comfortable silence of people who have said most of what needs saying and know that the rest of it is understood. "Are you thinking about the hay?" he said. "No," she said. "Neither am I," he said. She took his hand and they stood in the new field in the September morning, and she thought about pride, her pride, the armor she had worn so long it had become a second skin, and about how it had not diminished, not exactly, but had grown around other things, around trust and around the willingness to let one particular person see her whole, and around the knowledge that being seen whole and being strong were not opposites, had never been opposites, and that she had taken far too long to understand it, and she was glad she had understood it when she did. Thomas came running from the direction of the house, 4 years old and loud as his sister on a good day, shouting something about breakfast, and Perry turned from the field to meet him and swung him up onto his shoulders the way he always did. And Thomas grabbed his father's hat and put it on his own head where it fell over his eyes immediately. And Perry caught him and held him and walked back toward the house. And Edna followed them across the dew-wet grass of the field she had just bought, toward the house where Clara would be waking in her crib, and the stove needed lighting, and there was a whole long productive day ahead of her. She followed her family across the field in the September morning and felt the weight of everything that had come before, the grief and the fear and the hard work and the pride that had sometimes kept her too far from what she needed, and she felt it all transform, the way things transform in good soil, into something that was simply her life, her whole full life, and she was grateful for every part of it. Not 3 miles from where she stood, Caldwell went on being Caldwell, rough around the edges and growing, the trail still bringing cattle through, though the great era of the drives was drawing toward its close as the railroad moved and changed things, and the town was changing too, getting more settled, more permanent, the wildness of the frontier giving way by degrees to something more established. The world was always changing around the edges, and Edna had learned over the years to watch it carefully and adapt where adaptation was necessary and hold firm where firmness was required. But the farm held. It held through the dry summer of 1886 when the grass went brown, and the creek ran shallow, and they lost 2 horses to the heat, and brought the rest through by hauling water from the windmill Perry had built on the north end of the property 3 years before. It held through the winter of 1887, when the cold was biblical and half of Sumner County lost livestock, and the Archers lost some too, but not as many as their neighbors, because Perry had built the new barn with insulation in the walls, and Edna had laid in more feed than anyone thought was necessary. It held through the market fluctuations, and the good years and the hard years, and the years that were simply years, ordinary and particular, and full of the small accumulations of a life. Thomas grew into a boy who was serious and capable, and had his mother's precision and his father's patience, a combination that made him, as both parents had predicted, occasionally impossible to reason with and genuinely extraordinary. He was reading by 5 and breaking horses alongside his father by 12, and he had his mother's habit of looking at things until he understood them, and his father's habit of not making a fuss about what he saw. Clara grew into a girl who was loud and opinionated and affectionate, who loved horses and hated arithmetic and made friends with everyone in Caldwell, with an ease that Edna found both baffling and admirable, since ease with people had never been her particular gift. By 1885 there was a third child, a boy they named James, quieter than both the others and given to long observations of things, birds and weather and the way water moved in the creek, and he had some quality that was all his own, something patient and watchful, and Edna thought he might grow into an interesting man. The horse business was, by the mid-1880s, one of the best-regarded operations in Sumner County. Perry had built a reputation that brought buyers from considerable distances, and Edna had built the business side of it into something that left no money on the table and no agreement unclear. They were not wealthy people, not by any large measure, but they were comfortable and they were secure, which is what 40 acres of hard Kansas prairie had never quite been, and 120 acres with a good operation, and a clear deed was now fully and permanently. On a September evening in 1885, 7 years to the month after Perry Archer had ridden into Caldwell on a Tuesday, Edna and Perry sat on the porch of the farmhouse they had repainted twice now, the south-facing boards no longer peeling, the barn with its new roof solid and weather-tight. The children were inside, Thomas and Clara bickering in a desultory way over something that did not require intervention, James already asleep because James always went asleep without much argument. The evening was warm and the prairie stretched out in front of them, gold and brown in the early autumn, and the sky was the immense Kansas sky that had terrified or comforted depending on your state of mind and now did both at once, as it had learned to do for Edna over the years. 7 years, she said. You have been counting, he said. I always count things, she said. I know, he said. He reached over and took her hand on the arm of the porch chair, and she turned her hand in his, the familiar weight of it, the warmth. It was September when you came, she said. A Tuesday. You drove a hard bargain, he said. $3 a week and dry board, she said. It was a very reasonable arrangement. It was, he said. It led to excellent outcomes. She looked at him. The evening light was kind to both of them, as it is to people who have earned their faces by living in them, and she thought about all the things she might say, the many things she had thought over 7 years, and she selected the truest and simplest one. I am glad you followed me out, she said. He looked at her with those dark eyes that still, after everything, had the quality of seeing more than she intended to show, but no longer made her want to hide. They made her want to lean forward toward what was being seen. I am glad you let me, he said. She squeezed his hand. In the house behind them, Thomas and Clara had arrived at some resolution of their argument and were quiet, and James was somewhere in his dreams, and the horses were quiet in the pasture, and the creek ran along the south edge of the land, and the stars were coming out one by one over the enormous Kansas sky. Everything was as it should be. Not perfect, because nothing is perfect, and Edna had never put much faith in perfection. But sound, solid. Built on good ground by two people who had found each other by accident and chosen each other on purpose, and who had gone on choosing each other through all the ordinary and extraordinary days of a life shared, which is, in the end, the whole of the story. The first snow of the season came that night, light and early, just a dusting that coated the porch railing and the top of the fence posts, and melted before noon the next day. Edna came downstairs before dawn and found the kitchen cold and the wood box empty, and stood for a moment before she lit the stove herself, because she was perfectly capable of doing it. She had always been capable of doing it. But when Perry came downstairs a few minutes later and found the stove lit and the coffee on, he put his hands on her shoulders from behind and pressed his lips to the back of her hair, and she leaned back against him for a moment, just a moment, before turning to put his cup on the table. "First snow," she said. "First snow," he agreed. He sat down at the table and wrapped his hands around the cup and looked at her across the kitchen with the morning light beginning at the window, and she looked back at him. "It smells like iron," she said. He knew she was thinking about Caleb, and she knew he knew, and there was no difficulty in it, no ache, only the acknowledgement of a life that had held more than one chapter and arrived, somehow, at a place that was good. "I know," he said quietly. "It does." She sat down across from him, and they drank their coffee in the morning quiet before the children woke and the day made its full demands. And outside the snow had stopped and the first gray light was coming up over the prairie, and the farm waited, as it always did, patient and particular and thoroughly theirs. It was enough. It was, she thought, a very great deal more than enough.